Welcome to Weekly News Highlights, where we wrap up your week with a glimpse back into what went on in the past week. I'm Kim Dami in Seoul. Let's first look back using keywords. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is coming to Seoul on Sunday for summit talks with President Yoon Suk Yeol. His Seoul trip signifies the official resumption of more direct diplomacy between the two countries. It's been a week since President Yoon Suk Yeol wrapped up his state visit to the U.S. We take a look back at what turned out to be a fruitful trip and what needs to be done now to turn his achievements into tangible outcomes. The Federal Reserve approved its 10th interest rate increase in just a little over a year as its battle against inflation continues. Now, that means the interest rate gap between South Korea and the U.S. has widened to another record high. President Yoon Suk Yeol is poised to host Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida here in Seoul on Sunday. Now, the upcoming visit will be the first by a Japanese Prime Minister for a bilateral meeting in 12 years. Now, South Korea is seeing it as a complete resumption of regular reciprocal trips, or what the two nations' leaders called shuttle diplomacy. Earlier this week, the president's office made official that Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is coming to South Korea on Sunday for summit talks with President Yoon Suk Yeol. Now, for this weekend's weekly focus, we take a closer look at what to expect from the Yoon Kishida summit with our foreign affairs correspondent, Choi Min-jung. Welcome back, Min-jung.
Thank you for having me.
Sure, Min-jung. First off, the trip is largely anticipated to mark the official resumption of direct diplomacy between the two nations. Now, first off, why is this so significant?
Well, if we go back to March, the South Korean government compared the Seoul-Tokyo relations to a glass of water, saying that it was half full. This was when President Yoon visited Tokyo for summit talks with the Japanese Prime Minister. It was also when the two leaders were able to mend sour ties, as Yoon proposed a plan to compensate the Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor through a third party without contributions from Japanese companies. And since then, much progress has been made to normalize ties. South Korea fully restored its military intelligence sharing pact with Tokyo, also known as GSOMIA, while Japan put South Korea back on its white list of trusted trading partners. The two countries this week held their first finance leaders meeting in 7 years, and Japan's national security advisor came to South Korea to prepare for the summit and conveyed that Kishida's visit is a way to show gratitude for Yoon's, quote, courageous decision to improve relations with Japan. And now we will have to see if the half-full glass will slowly fill up. South Korea and Japan both said Kishida's upcoming visit would mark the resumption of regular visits to each other's countries, or what they have been calling shuttle diplomacy. Progress is being made rather quickly, as the summit was anticipated to take place around the summer, but it's actually taking place less than 2 months after Yoon visited Japan. The upcoming visit will also be the first by a Japanese Prime Minister for a bilateral meeting in 12 years. And talking to reporters earlier on Tuesday, the Japanese leader said the summit will be a good opportunity to exchange honest opinions on ways to develop Seoul-Tokyo relations.
I expect it will be a great opportunity to give impetus to our shuttle diplomacy and have a heart-to-heart exchange of our views on accelerating Japan-South Korea ties and drastically changing the global situation.
Right, reciprocal visits in just 2 months from both sides. Now, South Korea and Japan do seem to be on the right track in terms of moving forward. Then, what are some of the key items on the agenda of the summit that we can expect this weekend?
Right. Well, a presidential official said that there are many pending issues, but the most important are cooperation in security and the economy. The leaders are expected to discuss ways to strengthen their security cooperation to counter growing threats from North Korea. They're also likely to agree on the need to boost trilateral cooperation between Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo. Kyodo News also reported that security cooperation against Pyongyang will be accelerated during the summit. As for economic cooperation, Japan recently lifted export curbs on South Korea, And sources are saying that Kishida will meet with South Korean business leaders to discuss ways to enhance economic exchanges between the two countries. So we are sensing a more future-oriented discussion, but here in Korea, eyes are on whether Kishida will offer a sincere apology from Japan for the use of forced labor during its occupation of Korea.
Right, Min-jung. But the thing is, the Korean public can't help but focus on the past involving Japan's wartime forced labor. Can we expect any progress on this during the summit this weekend?
Right. The public opinion in South Korea right now is that Japan's response with regard to this matter has not been enough. During the Seoul-Tokyo summit in March, Kishida confirmed that he upholds historical perceptions of previous Japanese governments, which includes Japan's apology for its colonization of Korea in the Joint Declaration of 1998. However, he did not repeat the statements word for word, nor did he offer a sincere apology. But Seoul's presidential office said that it would be difficult to expect a forward-looking attitude for now because diplomacy has just been restored and more trust needs to be built. Earlier on, South Korea's national security advisor also refrained from giving a clear stance and rather stressed the importance of balance between the past and present. Prior to the summit, President Yoon also stressed that South Korea and Japan must join forces as partners pursuing common interests based on common values and underlined the importance of exchanges between young generations of the two countries in preparation for the future. So the overall mood is that rather than receiving an immediate favorable response from Japan on issues in the past, the presidential office seems likely to focus on accelerating the process of improving Seoul-Tokyo relations and further strengthening cooperation with the U.S. and Japan.
Now, speaking of cooperation with the U.S. and Japan, Kishida's Seoul trip comes ahead of a possible summit between the leaders of Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo in Hiroshima. That's where the G7 will take place, right?
Right. Kishida invited Yoon to the G7 summit back in March, and it's still being arranged, but the three nations are expected to hold a summit in Hiroshima and once again reaffirm their commitment to deepening their partnership against North Korea's nuclear threats. The latest developments come at a much-needed time for the allies as tensions continue to grow against not just North Korea, but China and Russia as well. Pyongyang, Beijing, and Moscow strongly criticized Yoon and Biden's recent signing of the Washington Declaration, and Beijing's Global Times reported that once Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington's cooperation expands further and targets China and Russia, it will not only break the current balance of power, but China and Russia will take corresponding precautions and even countermeasures. It also warned that South Korea will only degrade its own position in Asia by taking the side of the U.S. and Japan.
Right, we're only into the first week of May, but already so many events, even summits on the diplomatic front.
Right, we'll have to see how things will unfold in the geopolitical scene.
All right, Min-jung, thank you so much for joining us here in the studio today again.
My pleasure.
One of the key outcomes from President Yoon Suk Yeol's U.S. state visit was a separate agreement on ways to beef up deterrence against North Korea's provocations. Now, that is the Washington Declaration, which raised questions about how similar or different the deal is compared to NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement with the U.S. Our Bae-eun-ji explains.
The new Washington Declaration between South Korea and the U.S. involves the creation of a Nuclear Consultative Group, or NCG, where the two countries will share information on nuclear assets and intelligence, and jointly plan responses and exercises. Seoul's presidential office said the Nuclear Consultative Group will hold consultations 4 times a year, with 2 or 3 to come later this year. In a joint press briefing following the summit, President Yoon had said they'll discuss ways to conduct joint operations using both countries' weapons.
북한의 위협에 대응하여 핵과 전략무기 운영 계획에 대한 정보를 공유하고 한국의 첨단 재래식 전력과 미국의 핵전력을 결합한 공동작전을 함께 기획하고 실행하기 위한 방안을 정기적으로 협의할 것이며 그 결과는 양 정상에게 보고될 것입니다.
The newly created NCG is similar to NATO's consultative group, the NPG, but there are some differences. The biggest difference is the deployment of U.S. nuclear assets. As for NATO, U.S.-owned nuclear weapons are stored in 5 member states, including Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Turkey. But under the NCG, nuclear assets will not be stationed in South Korean territory. Biden specifically underscored that Washington would not deploy nuclear weapons on the peninsula. Instead, U.S. will periodically dock its nuclear-armed submarine and other strategic assets in South Korea. Another difference is that the NCG is a bilateral agreement between South Korea and the U.S., whereas NATO's NPG is a multilateral agreement. But under both agreements, the U.S. has operational control of the nuclear weapons. There are some concerns that the new deal may not be as effective as NATO's arrangement with the U.S., as a U.S. official even said that although the Washington Declaration will help deter North Korean threats, it's not a nuclear sharing agreement. Some experts have even assessed that Biden is committed to giving Seoul a central role in strategic planning, as South Korea reaffirmed its commitment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty by putting aside efforts to pursue its own nuclear arsenal. 배은지, 아리랑뉴스.
Andy Kim is a U.S. congressman. He is one of only 4 currently holding the position with Korean ancestry. He says the Korea-U.S. alliance goes beyond the executive branches of the two countries. Our Kim Do-yeon spoke to him in Washington, D.C.
U.S. diplomat turned lawmaker Andy Kim says South Korea and the United States are in it together no matter what happens, as the two countries mark the 70th year of their bilateral alliance. Speaking to Arirang following President Yoon Suk Yeol and Joe Biden's summit last week, Kim stressed that the summit proved Washington is committed to working with Seoul in various strategic areas.
Anything that happens, it happens together, that there's going to be that consultation, and we can absolutely have assurances that we will never leave the South Korea exposed or vulnerable. That's part of what this was all about. We have a strategic interest in South Korea as a whole, and that's something that we're going to protect.
Kim also said the two leaders showing a, quote, embedded relationship, and that level of engagement will help the two get through global conflicts that the two countries may face in the future. He also added the alliance goes beyond just the two presidents and that there is a bipartisan support at U.S. Congress, which plays a key role in the alliance as well. In fact, at the U.S. Senate, while President Yoon was in Washington, a resolution was unanimously passed which welcomed the state visit by President Yoon and highlighted the importance of the ROK-U.S. alliance.
I also recognize that you got to have the resources and that deeper commitment, and that's what comes with the United States Congress. That's why it's so important that we had that joint session, an opportunity for all of us in Congress to come together and recognize and support this strategic alliance.
In light of the U.S. observance of AAPI month in May, Kim also shed light on his role as a Korean American and also an Asian American in the legislative branch. There are currently 4 members of the House with Korean ancestry, evenly split between the Democrats and Republicans.
When we see right now rising discrimination and violence against the Asian American community, you can't guarantee that the government's going to focus on that. It helps to have people that understand the experiences and the challenges of certain communities and background.
Kim further highlighted the role of Asian Americans as a bridge in the global community in times of high geopolitical tensions.
When we're focused on these issues right now about foreign policy, about having increased action towards the Indo-Pacific, and we have tensions and challenges between the United States and China, it's good to have Asian Americans be able to be people that not only understand the nuances here in America, but could also potentially be a bridge in helping us engage with the rest of the world too.
Calling South Korea a, quote, top-tier world power, Kim also expressed hope that South Korea will continue to step up not only as a regional leader, but a global pivotal state. Kim Do-yeon, 아리랑뉴스, Washington, D.C.
Culture is one of the 5 main pillars of Seoul-Washington cooperation. President Yoon's U.S. trip was especially meaningful in that the spotlight was shown on K-culture and K-content and secured investment and promising projects. Our culture correspondent Song Yu-jin tells us more.
Last week's South Korea-U.S. summit showed the power of culture in diplomacy. President Yoon Suk Yeol's first official stop in the U.S. was to meet the CEO of Netflix. The company has pledged to invest a whopping $2.5 billion in Korean content over the next 4 years. That's double the amount it's put into Korea since 2016. The streaming giant also signed a memorandum of understanding with the Korea Creative Content Agency and the Korean Film Council to support future talent. This move is expected to open more doors to K-content.
Korean content creators and filmmakers will have the opportunity to experience how the biggest streaming platform produces its shows. This will create a pool of skilled creators, which could attract more investment in K-content.
At the Global Creative Industry Leadership Forum, President Yoon discussed ways to boost cooperation with video content titans like Walt Disney and Warner Brothers. Seoul's Culture Ministry also signed an MOU with the Smithsonian Institution, a group of museums, education, and research centers that will allow museums and art galleries to swap collections and collaborate on research. Culture Minister Park Bo-gyun attended all of these events. One expert says this shows that culture is at the forefront of diplomacy.
This highlights the growing importance of soft power like culture. Countries are now forging stronger diplomatic relations through cultural exchange programs and MOUs. And there hasn't been this much talk on cultural exchanges in the history of the South Korea-U.S. alliance.
But there's still a lot of work to be done.
Getting to know each other's cultures can really bring people closer together, so it's important to continue these partnerships long term. The thing is, many people want to see concrete progress within a few years or so. We should keep in mind that though the benefits of cultural exchanges might not be evident right away, they can lead to warm, long-lasting bonds between countries.
To make this possible, the Culture Ministry is creating a South Korea-U.S. Culture Alliance task force to recheck related policies and come up with follow-up measures. 송유진, 아리랑뉴스.
The U.S. Fed raised interest rates to the highest in 16 years on Wednesday as its fight against inflation continues. But the central bank has opened the door to a pause in the tightening cycle. Let's turn to our Shinayong.
The U.S. Federal Reserve raised its interest rates by 25 basis points on Wednesday, taking another so-called baby step. This marks the 10th consecutive rate hike since March last year. And with the Fed's move, the U.S. benchmark interest rate jumped to the 5% to 5.25% range, the highest since 2007. The Fed's efforts to tame inflation come despite ongoing concerns about recent bank failures and follow the takeover of First Republic Bank by banking giant J.P. Morgan Chase. According to the central bank, the U.S. banking system is sound and resilient.
Inflation has moderated somewhat since the middle of last year. Nonetheless, inflation pressures continue to run high, and the process of getting inflation back down to 2% has a long way to go.
All eyes were on the FOMC, with watchers wondering if the Fed would pivot rates, as it's been widely noted that rates have reached close to their peak. However, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell responded to the question of whether the central bank will pause its monetary tightening in June, saying there was no decision yet, but the committee will consider the impact of tightened monetary policy on economic activity and inflation, as well as financial developments. But he did hint at a possible pause in the monetary tightening cycle.
In the statement from March, we had a sentence that said the committee anticipates that some additional policy firming may be appropriate. That sentence is not in the statement anymore. That's a meaningful change, that we're no longer saying that we anticipate.
Meanwhile, despite the expected rate hike, U.S. stocks closed lower on Wednesday. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 0.8%, while the S&P 500 slipped 0.7%, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq lost 0.46%. The falls are attributed to the Fed not clearly announcing the direction of its future monetary policy, which raised concerns that it may not begin cutting interest rates soon. 신하영, 아리랑뉴스.
The troubled First Republic Bank has officially been handed over to J.P. Morgan Chase this week. Our 송유진 has this report.
San Francisco-based First Republic Bank, which had been the 14th biggest commercial bank in the U.S. last year, has been sold to banking giant J.P. Morgan Chase after being taken over by financial regulators. On Monday local time, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation announced that it has seized First Republic and that J.P. Morgan Chase will be purchasing all of the troubled bank's deposits and assets. According to the FDIC, as of April 13th, First Republic had approximately $229.1 billion in total assets and $103.9 billion in total deposits. Following the announcement, U.S. President Joe Biden greatly welcomed the deal.
I'm pleased to say that the regulators have taken action to facilitate the sale of First Republic Bank and ensure that all depositors are protected and the taxpayers are not on the hook.
This comes a few days after First Republic reported losing about 40% of its deposits in the first quarter of this year. Depositors started losing confidence in the bank, pulling out their money after witnessing the failures of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank in March. Despite a $30 billion rescue package from 11 banks in mid-March, the situation worsened, with the bank's stock falling more than 75% last week. After a rocky few months for the U.S. banking sector, J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon told analysts over the phone that though there are chances that another smaller bank may fail, Monday's takeover has pretty much ended the current banking crisis. With Monday's takeover, all 84 First Republic offices across 8 U.S. states are reopening as J.P. Morgan branches. 송유진, 아리랑뉴스.
Marking the first anniversary of President Yoon Suk Yeol's inauguration, a public garden for children has opened near presidential office in Yongsan. It used to be a military compound, which South Korean citizens were not allowed to enter for over a century. But the garden is now open to the public. Our Oh Soo-young gives us a glimpse.
A scenic space to find freedom, openness, and a peace of mind. Seoul is opening a large public garden in the central district of Yongsan, in place of a former military compound that shunned South Koreans from its gates for over a century. President Yoon Suk Yeol on Tuesday hosted an outdoor lunch for media at the pine grass lawn within the Yongsan Children's Garden ahead of its official opening at 2 p.m. on Thursday. Dedicated to future generations, Yoon said he envisioned the garden as a place for children to run and play freely on the grass.
Thursday's opening comes just a few days before the first anniversary of President Yoon's inauguration. The timing highlighted the South Korean leader's push for freedom and openness as he expressed willingness to spend more time with media to communicate freely and asked them to help in building a brighter future for the nation.
Located in front of the presidential office, with the National Museum of Korea to its side, the garden represents Yoon's pledge to communicate with and be closer to the people when he relocated his office to the Yongsan district. The opening of the garden gates is also historically significant for South Koreans. The 230,000 square meters of greenery is now being returned to the Korean public after it was occupied for 120 years, first by Imperial Japanese troops who installed the main entrance, then gradually converted into a U.S. military base upon South Korea's liberation in 1945. Soon it will be open to all, featuring a huge lawn area as its centerpiece with a sports field to its east. To the west, a trail of houses with red tile roofs, formerly home to U.S. military officials, stretches from the main entrance. Key locations include archives, a library and a hall that unwinds the location's decades of history in photos and records, from Japan's brutal colonization to the years of war between the two Koreas, bringing visitors to the present day where South Korea stands as a liberal democracy. To mark the launch of the garden, the exhibition hall will hold a light-themed display, and children's football and baseball games will kick off on the opening day. The opening hours are 9 a.m. to 6 p.m, with prior reservation required for first-time visitors. Reservations can be made on the Yongsan Children's Garden website 5 days in advance for Korean citizens and 10 days for foreign visitors. Oh Soo-young, 아리랑뉴스.
That wraps up this week's weekly news highlights. Have a lovely weekend.